Good evening and welcome. My name is Donald Hyman, and I'm going to be doing a presentation this evening on the Harlem Renaissance 100th anniversary. I'd like to first thank Mr. Trayvon Jackson and all the staff at the African American Cultural Center here on South Pearl and Madison Avenue in the city of Albany. And I'd like to say it's Black History Month, and if you think of Harlem, most of us think of Harlem as being one of the greatest African American communities in the world. And yes, it does have that kind of flavor. But I want to go back a little bit and talk about the Harlem as it began and some of the people who were very significant in making the Harlem Renaissance a reality. In addition to that, I want to add that many of their contributions, we still have their impact today, in either institutions or through their music or through their writing. And I want to talk about them. Also, I've gone a step further in presenting in my presentation individuals who you don't necessarily hear about in presentations about the Harlem Renaissance. However, their contributions are significant and they deserve to be recognized. Let me go back a little bit. Harlem in the village of Manhattan is in the upper part of Manhattan. And if we go to 1900, that's about the time the subway system actually was going to go from downtown Manhattan all the way up to 145th Street in Harlem. As a result, a lot of real estate developers decided to build multi-family dwelling houses, apartment buildings, in other words. And as a result, they didn't fill up as much as they thought that they would, and so there was a surplus of housing in the area. Now, if you want to talk about the population of Harlem around this time, at the turn of the century, it was predominantly Irish, Italian, Jewish, German. And if you didn't have any African Americans in that particular community, they more than likely were servants to some of those families. But all of this was going to change very radically. In my presentation, I want to make people aware that what becomes the Black capital of the world, Harlem, in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, is composed of African American people who migrated largely from the southern part of the United States, on the East Coast, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and a large population of immigrants from the British West Indies, Jamaica, Trinidad. And we also have input and people from the Caribbean islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico. So in my presentation, I'm going to try to include all of those ethnic groups and their contributions, as well as not just men, but women who were very responsible for making the Harlem Renaissance a success. So let me begin. I'm going to begin with a man who started the largest movement, mass movement of African Americans in the 20th century. And that would be Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey was born in Jamaica. And there he was educated, and at I believe 14 or 15, he became an apprentice to learn how to be a printer. At some point he went to England and got further education, and he returned to Jamaica, where he started his organization, the United Negro Improvement Association. Interestingly enough, one of the people who influenced him the most that he read about in the United States was an African American man by the name of Booker T. Washington, who had done a lot of things for the Black community and was considered the main leader. There is documented correspondence that exists today where Marcus Garvey wrote Booker T. Washington, and Booker T. Washington wrote him back, corresponding in terms of getting his program off the ground and becoming a part of his organization. Well, by the time Garvey comes to New York in 1917, 1918, Booker T. Washington has passed away. They never really get to formally meet. However, Garvey comes to, of all places, Harlem, because by this time, in 1917, 1918, 1919, three-fourths of the African-American population in New York City lives in Harlem, and we're going to tell you why. We're talking about 50 to about 70,000 people, black people, live in the Harlem area because of one gentleman. And not all over Harlem, from like 110th Street to 145th Street, but the pockets around 134th, going over to the east side and west side, up to about 145th. By the time we get to the 30s and the 40s, then the population will begin to shift further south to 125th Street and finally to 106th Street and on down through the years. But remember, the population is not going to completely change, but it's centered around 135th Street, around the 20s. So let's continue with the story. Marcus Garvey, back to Marcus Garvey, please. Marcus Garvey, at the time of his mass meeting at Madison Square Garden in 1921, he has about 4 million members of his organization. And when I studied him, because I did a presentation for the Underground Railroad a couple of years ago, I was amazed at how far he had gone. You say, what's his contribution today? You look around, even you go downtown Albany, you see the red, black, and green flag. The red, black, and green flag is through Marcus Garvey's organization. Also, he coined the phrase "Black is beautiful." So a lot of what he talked about in terms of black people being proud of themselves, he begins to start that movement at that particular time. But more than that, he believed that we should do a lot of things for economics. And I found records of a lot of different businesses, bakeries, restaurants, and stores that they opened, buildings that they bought in the Harlem area. They had their own newspaper called The Negro World, which they distributed in the Caribbean, in England, around the United States. And they started what was known as a Black Star Line. They were going to do their own trading of goods, and stockholders were members of this organization. And they did get a ship off the ground, and there are pictures of them inaugurating it. The ship was called the SS Frederick Douglass, which was really interesting. But even more interesting, they were very enterprising. I found pictures of stores that made little black dolls. I wonder if you could find them today. That Marcus Garvey's organization, they produced their own black dolls because, as you know, most dolls for little children were not Negro, right? Did I say Negro? They were not black in those days, but I found pictures of them. They had their own little factories that made those type of things. I'd like to find out more about it. In addition to that, they would have these mass parades on Harlem, and there are films of this, and I suggest you see that, because when you think of Harlem, the name has been slandered with ghetto and slum, and when you see African Americans marching in these parades, and they're all dressed, and all the men have suits, and ties, and hats, and no sneakers, no jeans, no shoes, it's a different reality in terms of the order of who we thought of ourselves, and what we thought. Organized, discipline, unity. So a lot of what Marcus Garvey did is important, and as his mass movement spread, once again you say, how is it important today? Well, if I name two people, you're going to know those names. One is Malcolm X, and the other is Shirley Chisholm. Well, Malcolm X's father, if you saw the movie or read his book, his father was a Garvey. He was a member of Marcus Garvey's organization out in the Midwest. His organization, she was from Grenada, and the two of them had met at a convention for the United Negro Improvement Association in Canada. That's how they met, and they got married. Shirley Chisholm's father, when they lived in Brooklyn, was a member of the Garvey movement. So a lot of those ideas trickled down to those individuals, who Shirley was one of the first African-American women to run for president of the United States back in 72. And as you know, Malcolm X's story, he went on to lead the Nation of Islam and write his book and change the way we thought about ourselves. But those are some of the roots of Garvey's influence. And today, I really suggest that you read up about him, and then you're going to say, well, he was so great, he did all of this and that. What happened? What happened is basically, I can go into this in another story, but a gentleman, an organization called the Federal Bureau of Investigation, decided, they heard as he became more popular and had more followers and was in the newspaper, they decided to investigate him because they thought he was a Negro agitator, right? This is at a time when they're lynching black people like it's going out of style. You know, they even put newspaper articles in the paper to say that there's going to be a lynching, and people come dressed in their Sunday best like it's a picnic, bring their children, take pictures, and they don't do anything about that. But here's a black man who's telling his people to organize themselves and start their own businesses and jobs and do for self. And it's a threat to the society that they don't want to be servants anymore, that they want to be men. I question that. J. Edgar Hoover, this is one of his first assignments, because down the line, it's not going to be Garvey, it's going to be Malcolm X, and it's going to be Martin Luther King. He will continue throughout the rest of his life to harass Negro leaders and in a very negative, and try to eliminate them. But Garvey is his first. And then what was interesting about it, he couldn't get into his organization to get close enough to get anything on him. So what did he do? As racist as he was, he found a black policeman in Washington, D.C., and got him to get into the inner circle and to see if he could find some dirt on him. And they got Garvey on mail fraud. All right? He was deported. Let me add this. They wanted to go back to Africa, and they were communicating with people in Liberia. As you know, Liberia was one of the first black colonies of repatriation, where people from in the 19th century went from the United States back to Africa and set up that colony with the help of the United States. Well, they wanted to go to that area, and they had started having meetings and going into that area. And I believe it was the Firestone Rubber Company who had made a big deal with rubber in the Liberia area to not let them go along with that deal. So that deal shut down. But still, he had people that had already gone over there to set up negotiations to start a colony over there of bringing black people from different parts of the world to resettle in Africa. So, in addition to that, they deported him. And during this time period, we're talking about in the early 1900s, 1920s, early 1900s, most of the Caribbean and Africa and Asia are what's known as colonies. It's a period of colonialism. And not the United States itself feared Garvey as much as the British Empire and the other European colonies, because his movement and his newspapers were getting into places like South Africa and not just Jamaica, but parts of the Central America, and they were telling these people to organize and unify themselves. It was a big threat, and so they got him to England, and they put him in jail there, and he remained in England, and he passed away there. But his wife continued to keep most of his writings and library together. So I suggest you do some reading, because during the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance, Marcus Garvey definitely had a lot of power, not just in Harlem, but around the world. His center, though, was in Harlem. So, and that was during the Harlem Renaissance. Next slide, please. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you about Black Swan Records. Most of you have heard about other record companies. In fact, most of the people listening to this know that we African Americans have a lot of records, and we've been musicians and music groups, from jazz to rock and roll to blues. And interestingly enough, when I did the research and I found out about this, and it fits into the Harlem Renaissance, is when the phonograph record is invented and they begin to record music, they record everybody. They refuse the companies, the music industry companies, refuse to sign any black artist. Refuse to record them. And Harry Pace Jr. and W.C. Handy, who wrote the Beale Street Blues and St. Louis Blues, they were very popular, and they knew how to publish. They knew about the publishing side of writing the music, composing, but they wanted those songs to be recorded by white artists. And Harry Pace felt that that wasn't fair, that you have all these black artists that are very talented, and they can't get recorded, all right? Why should you worry about somebody else recording you when you can record yourself? And he used his money and his influence, and he had a brownstone in Harlem. He originally was from Georgia. He went to Morehouse, and he decided to set up his own record company. And it was called Black Swan Records, and it was named after a black opera singer back in the 19th century. He decided that he wanted to show people that black people could do all kinds of music. So they did spirituals, they did opera, they did classics, and they also did blues and jazz, or ragtime at this time. We're talking about them setting up in 1921 in Harlem, in his brownstone, and they recorded in his basement. So he was really enterprising. Well, it doesn't sell very well until a blues artist whose name is Ethel Waters. You can get to know her because what she accomplishes is pretty phenomenal too. She records a song with their house band, who's led by Fletcher Henderson. If you get into jazz, he's very well known. And their music arranger, excuse me, his name is William Grant Steele, and he's one of the premier black composers in classic music. They record her on this record called Down Home Blues. For the record, it's called Down Home Blues. And something happens. The record sells about 500,000 copies. And that's a lot of records in those days. And it's promoted in black press, Crisis Magazine, and the big record companies then begin to notice that there's a market out there for black music. Listen to what's going to happen now. Black Swan Records sends Ethel Waters on tour because this record is very popular all around the country and people want to see her perform. The newspapers around the country talk about the show is coming, they review it, and so she becomes bigger and bigger, and they record more records and they sell. The major record companies at that time begin to say, oh, we can make some of this money too. They're not really interested in the fact, oh, we need to hire some blacks. Or, they see that there's a gold mine there. You're thinking, oh, well, this is great. Well, guess what? They decide in their infinite wisdom to create what's known as a race record division. So they hire black artists like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith, and they record them. And they're marketed in what's known, it's on the label, it'll say Race Records. And they have the most, today what we call the racist stereotypical advertisements. Some black guys gambling with a bottle of liquor, and some lady looking very loose standing by the side of the door. And they would say the ultimate blues records. This is what they got away with. The bottom line was Black Swan Records would counteract by saying, we're the original, buy our records. And they have Pullman porters transporting their records across country. Harry Pace Jr. was smart enough to buy facility where they didn't have to have somebody print their records. They printed them themselves. Until a new invention came out that reduced the record companies from 24 to about 7. What was this new invention? Ladies and gentlemen, it would make you or break you if you were in the record business at that time. It was called the radio. And you laugh, oh, what, the radio? We have radio, people still buy records. See, they weren't working hand in hand. Like, the records come out, you promote them, then you want to go buy them. That comes a little bit later. When people found out they can get a machine that played music, they didn't have to buy music, right? Think about this. When the television comes out, the radio industry suffers. A lot of the TV shows like Lucy and the Westerns and Phil Silvers, all of those shows were on the radio, and they just got lifted and taken to television audience. And for a while, radio was suffering until they found a way to bounce back with rock and roll and the new sounds of the rock. So it was a time period, but at that time, Harry Pace Jr. went to his board, which included people like W.E.B. Du Bois, you've heard of Du Bois, and W.C. Handy, and he explained to them the bottom line. They had their assets weren't that great. So what they did was they decided to sell their record company over to Paramount, and Paramount was going to handle Black Swan Records. Okay, so the moral of this story is, because of Black Swan Records, it opened up the record industry to black entertainers. Nowadays, you think of a blues artist as an African-American man playing the guitar, but originally, because of Ethel Waters' influence, the companies wanted a black woman who could sing the blues. So it starts a chain reaction. You go from Ethel Waters to Ma Rainey. You heard of Ma Rainey. Everybody's watching Ma Rainey Black Bottom now. Ma Rainey. Then it's Bessie Smith. Then it's Billie Holiday. Then it's Ella Fitzgerald. Then it's Dinah Washington. And I think where the line finally cuts, because she's the last one that can really do blues, was with Aretha Franklin. But the record industry always this black woman with this great voice to carry on that tradition, and that's how it begins. Ethel Waters, you should look up, because in her career, at one time, she was one of the highest paid actresses on Broadway, performers on Broadway. And when the first television came out in 1939, it featured her performing. So she eventually got nominated for an Oscar. She won the Drama Academy Award. She won the Tony. She won an Emmy, and then she wound up in her later years performing with Billy Graham Crusade. But Ethel Waters was very much a part of the Harlem Renaissance and getting the black music industry, black artists into the mainstream industry. So look up some information about Black Swan Records, Harry Pace. By the way, when Harry Pace left the music industry, he moved to Chicago and started the largest black insurance company in the world. And guess what? One of the gentlemen that worked for him as an insurance agent was a gentleman called John H. Johnson. Who's John H. Johnson out there, guys? Oh, you never heard of Ebony magazine. Never mind. Let's go on to the next one. Small world. This gentleman, we have to go back a little bit. When he starts out in Harlem, it's before the Harlem Renaissance. But he's the gentleman who the Harlem that we know now in the 30s, 40s, 50s that we become Black Harlem was Italian, it was Jewish, it was German. What happened was, it's interesting, and I'm going to do more research on this, because the African American population around 1900 to like 1915, when Mr. Payton opened up Harlem, mainly lived along from like before they built Penn Station, from 34th Street up on the west side, going up outside of Times Square behind that, and a little bit where Lincoln Center is built today. That was kind of the black community, right? And it was pretty rough. There were a lot of crime, there were a lot of things going on, and they were constantly being moved and pushed. And in New York City, they would, in Georgia or Alabama, you have a white town and a black town. In New York City, you had a black town and a white town, because if you lived in a building, only blacks could live in that building. You wouldn't rent to whites. Only it was black only. And so you created this community. In Harlem, you had buildings that were nothing but white people lived in. And according to Mr. Payton, two landlords got into arguments about something. And to pay one of the other ones back, he decided to start renting to blacks, which people in Harlem at that time, whites in Harlem, didn't like. They formed organizations to prevent the neighborhood from changing. Okay? I'll read a little bit about a write-up that was in one of the papers at that time. Philip Hayden came to New York in 1899 to seek his fortune. He struggled to survive working as a barber, handyman, and finally, ready for this, a janitor in a real estate office. And he soon scraped together enough money and opened his own real estate office, in which said, "Colored man makes a specialty of managing colored tenements." And Mr. Payton later said, "My first opportunity came as a result of a dispute between two landlords in West 134th Street." So I told you, the Harlem that we know in the 20s and 30s really centers around 130, the 130s and 140s, not the with Apollo is 125th. That happens later in the towards the 40s. To get even one of them turned his house over to me to fill with colored tenants. I was successful in renting and managing this house, and after a time, I was able to induce other landlords to give me their houses to manage. Within 2 years, he was managing nearly a dozen properties and began buying buildings of his own. Now, here's what you need to hear. For the first time in 3 centuries, the city's black citizens were offered decent housing. Okay? Can you imagine you're a black professional and you want to get a nice house and you can't because of what's available to you? So Philip Hayden opened it up. The people that were moving into Harlem at this time were pretty upper class, and they had the money. They just weren't able to get good housing, and finally they could. Before he passed away in 1917, he had bought about 6 apartment buildings worth about $1 million. We're talking about 1917, all right? Do you know what that $1 million would be like worth today? Probably about $500 million. So he was wheeling and dealing in a big, happy way. He had his own Afro-American real estate company. And as much as we know about Harlem, we need to understand that without Philip Hayden, it wouldn't happen, because at the time he passed away, 50,000 to 70,000 African Americans lived in what we know as the Harlem area, mainly around the 30s and 40s. But they would be the people who would lead the Harlem Renaissance. And the Black Harlem that we know begins through Philip Hayden. And so we owe him a lot. Thank you, Philip. Okay. All right. In this program, we're doing business, literature, art contributions, as well as politics. The next gentleman is a household name all over the world. Duke Ellington, or Edward Kennedy Ellington, as he was born in Washington, D.C., came to New York in the 1920s with a band. His band was then called, not the Duke Ellington Orchestra, but the Washingtonians. And one of the things that I have to tell you about Ellington is he was savvy to the business game. You know, he knew how to write music. He knew how to arrange music because he was a band leader. But at the same time, he understood that if you composed a song and wrote it, he would go down to Tin Pan Alley and be able to get it published. What's the importance of that? You get the royalties off that. That's your song. It's registered. Somebody else wants to record it. They make money off it. They got to give you a certain percent. He understood this game, so later on, he stayed a wealthy man because people constantly recorded his songs. We opened the program with his theme song, which is one of Harlem's theme song, "Take the A Train," which Duke is famous for. But he's got a lot of other ones. But let's get back to his story. Why is he important to the Harlem Renaissance? Jazz, as we know it now, wasn't as popular, but Duke Ellington made it popular. Why? People like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong were in bands, and they traveled. What changed the dynamic was, well, of course, the record industry, but even more so, I said that invention, the what? The RADIO. When Duke Ellington was hired to perform at the Cotton Club in Harlem on Lenox Avenue, let me tell you a little bit about the Cotton Club. It was the most outstanding nightclub in the world. The who's who of the rich and famous came up to Harlem every night to get into the Cotton Club. And that included actors and movie stars and politicians and the famous. They came to see black entertainers like Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington ran the house band with people like Lena Horne or Louis Armstrong or Billie Holiday. They performed there. In 1927, when Ellington started at the Cotton Club, let's go back a little bit, because everybody knows that word Cotton Club. Those of you that are out there, have you ever heard of Jack Johnson, the first African-American heavyweight champion of the world? Well, as quietly as it's kept, before it was the before it was the Cotton Club, it was called the Plantation Inn. And guess who owned it? Jack Johnson. Well, some of the gangsters in the area, I was told, made him an offer he couldn't refuse. At the same time, I believe he needed some money because he wasn't fighting at this time. And he sold the place to them. Being that it was Prohibition, the Cotton Club, people went there and they went to Harlem because you could get booze illegally, but you could get it. But the shows at the Cotton Club were world famous. In addition to being world famous, they had live radio broadcasts from the Cotton Club that you can get copies of, where they broadcast all around the nation. So Duke Ellington became famous that way. And in addition to that, they were being broadcast in Germany, in Paris, and London. So everybody knew about Duke Ellington and the Cotton Club. So he opened the doors for a lot of African Americans and musicians. And when he left the Cotton Club, who took his place? Cab Calloway, all right? But Ellington went on through the rest of his life to write even more profound music. Sophisticated Lady, take this, what is it? It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing, okay? Satin Doll. Duke Ellington was a genius. And he starts out in the Harlem Renaissance, okay? Let's go into the next one. How you doing out there, ladies and gentlemen? Hope you're enjoying this as much as I am. Now, I said I was going to cover the arts, politics, literature, and as well as business of the Harlem Renaissance. Now, at a time when the main artists were gentlemen, this lady stands out. She could hold her own. And I wanted to highlight her because Augusta Savage, who came up from Florida, got a scholarship to Cooper Union, and she studied sculpturing. And most of her sculptures are very Afrocentric and very beautiful. And the most famous one is the one she did of her nephew. It's called Gammon, where you see the little boy. It's a bust, but he's got this hat on, tipped to the side, you know? And in addition to doing that one, her most famous piece that was done was a piece called The Harp. And it was she was commissioned to do it for the World's Fair in New York City. And what she did was she took 12 people, African American people, and made their heads part of like a choir, part of the harp. And they were singing "Lift Every Voice and Sing." So it went on display at the World's Fair, and after it was taken apart. But you can get reproductions of it, smaller pieces as artwork. Her other great contribution was the Harlem Community Arts Center. She was the director of it. And during the Depression, it was free to anybody that wanted to paint, do sculpting, any kind of draw art. She would instruct them. And one of her finest people was this next gentleman. Okay, one of her students who became world famous, probably one of the most famous African American artists, Jacob Lawrence. You can't go nowhere and not see Jacob Lawrence's art. They're usually in calendars and in prints. A lot of libraries have his posters up. And what's interesting about his art is it usually deals with African American history, Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. And there's usually a couple of different panels to tell the story. The Great Migration. You see people huddled in the train stations or trying to get to New York City or Chicago, or Toussaint Louverture, Haitian Revolution. All of his pieces deal with Black history. And he was one of her students. And the side story is when I was growing up as a little kid in Brooklyn, I lived in Fort Greene, right off the DeKalb Avenue, not too far from Long Island University. Those of you that know of Brooklyn, and Kingsview Co-ops were one of the first that they built there. And guess who lived around the corner from me? Jacob Lawrence. At that time, my grandfather worked in the building as a security guard, and he said, "Yeah, I know that fella. He's the only Black man they lived there." Well, he was a professor and probably the most famous African-American artist in the world. How could they refuse him? That's what I say. But later on, I got to appreciate the fact that I lived not too far from Jacob Lawrence. That's another story. Okay, let's go on to the next one, please. I hope everybody is enjoying yourself. Now we're going to have some fun, ladies and gentlemen. This lady is one of my favorites. Another Floridian who migrated to New York City. She is with the Harlem Renaissance from the beginning, and she is a writer. She went to Howard University, and one of her professors was part of the group that was having the literature contest that people like Langston Hughes became famous and won awards. She won an award also for one of her short stories. All of you know Langston Hughes wrote the Weary Blues. He got an award for that too. After that, they got sponsors among a lot of writers and magazines and other newspapers, but their main source of publishing was African-American magazines like the Crisis magazine. She lived in Harlem, and she was an interesting one in the sense that when they usually present the Harlem Renaissance and the writers, they present the male writers, and there were a lot of them, but Zora could hold her own among any of them. And what made her distinct and more interesting was she entered Columbia University, majored in anthropology, and one of her classmates, see, this is what's interesting about how you tell stories. Zora Neale Hurston was classmates with Margaret Mead. If I say Margaret Mead, oh, she's a woman anthropologist. So was Zora Neale Hurston. Let's give her perks. And her subjects, she got grants to go first to Harlem, because what Zora Neale felt was that if she didn't research and record stories from African Americans, that a lot of the people, like some of them that were still slaves, had those tales. And then she was in Florida and she saw Bahamians doing their festivals, and she said she went to the Bahamas, interviewed them, and found out about that culture. So she did research on Afrocentric culture. And she traveled to New Orleans studying. She traveled to various kind of workers' camps in the South to get stories that they had, folk tales. And then she travels to Jamaica and just to do some research, as well as to Haiti. While she's in Haiti, she writes her most famous book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, which now she got her revenge because it's required reading in college and high schools, as well as it's a movie with Halle Berry that Oprah Winfrey produced. Very good movie too, but the book is even better. And she based it on going to the Bahamas to do her research, and they had a hurricane, and it just flooded everything, and she wrote about being in that situation before things calmed down. So when you read the book, there's a point where she's in a flood. You feel like you're in the flood. She details it that well. You feel like you're in the flood with her. So Zora was phenomenal. She became like a journalist. She wrote articles for magazines. She even went to Hollywood during the 40s to become a screenwriter for Paramount. Get that, all right? But I'm going to have some fun, and are we going to be able to communicate with people so they can chat? Okay, Zora Neale Hurston, one of her projects was to go to Harlem, and she wrote what was called the Harlem Slang Dictionary. And guess what? It was categorized from A to Z. And when I read through it, I did this with some of my students at the College of St. Rose, I found out that a lot of terms that I used growing up in the hood in Brooklyn, that they came out of that jazz period in the 20s in Harlem, and I never knew what they really meant. So, those of you out there, put on your hip caps. We're about to go down hippy dippy road. What does the following word mean? And then I'll count to 3, and you can write it, and we'll see who got the right answer. Word number 1, Astroporius. I repeat, Astroporius. 1, 2, 3. Anybody guess what it means? Okay, I'll tell them. They don't want to guess. It means to be a big shot. Hey! So next time somebody says that you're a big shot, say, no, I'm Astroporius. I'm Astroporius. All right, here's another one. Does anybody know what collar a nod means? What does, I want to collar a nod. This is like Jeopardy, y'all. 10, 9, 8. Somebody knows what that means. Don't be scared. All right, give up. Collar or nod means to take a sleep. All right? All right, give you a hint. If collar or nod means to go to sleep, what does collar a hot mean? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Well, collar a hot means to get a meal. Collar a nod means to get a sleep. Collar a hot means to get something to eat. All right. The next one. All you're going to get this right. What does it mean when somebody says, I dig it? She's listening to people in Harlem the way they're talking in the 20s, and she's writing it down. Dig means understand. Okay. Let's go down. We're in the D's. Let's see what we got here. Okay, we're going to go to the F's. I never knew, there was a song that I used to love and we used to dance to, a Motown song that was named after this. But basically, the word function has a different meaning to these jazz type people. What does it mean? Give up? I'm looking at Mr. Jackson here. He's got that look on his face. Watch this. There was a song called I'm Getting Ready for the Function at the Junction. Baby, you better come on right now. Function means a real down-to-earth, blue lights in the basement party. So the word function means to go to a real serious party, right? Let's go to the H's. All you're going to get this right. What does it mean when I say, I'm hauling out of here? It means I'm getting out of here. I'm fleeing on foot. You're going to love this one. I'm cracking, but I'm facking. Means I'm wisecracking, but I'm telling you the truth. Watch this. I shot him lightly and he died politely. Means I completely outdid him. Almost there. I see you out there laughing. Okay, this is how they talk. I'm sure she didn't get this all in one day, and she probably didn't get this hanging out in church. All right. Knock yourself out. You got it? Oh, you got it. Okay. It means have a good time. Ain't nothing to that bear but his curly hair. That one means I call you a bluff. You ain't nothing to you. Ain't no big thing. I ain't scared of you. You say that all. Next time when somebody wants to say, oh, ain't nothing to that bear with his curly hair. And the one I like to most from her, and the one I use the most is, you got to go there to know there. Hey, you got to go there to know there. What does that mean? That's Zora's way of saying, if you want to know my story, you got to walk my shoes. Okay? But Zora didn't make a lot of money in her time. She did receive money for the book. And she returned to Florida, and she eventually became a substitute teacher living in the trailer. And she was so poor at the time of her passing that people in her, where she lived, had to get the money together to bury her. Meanwhile, in the 70s, Alice Walker was taking a course and discovered her books and how good she was, and went down to Florida, found her grave, and put a gravestone there. Now, Eatontown, where she was born, the Black Town, one of the first to be incorporated, has a Zora Neale Festival every year. She was revived and relived. And she's one of our greatest writers, a woman, but she comes out of the Harlem Renaissance, and that's very important. So let's go with the next one. Love you, Zora. Arturo Schomburg. Arturo Schomburg is a gentleman who did a lot in terms of what he did to provide for our African American history and culture. He was born in Puerto Rico, and his mother, Mary Joseph, was from the Virgin Islands. When he came to New York City in like 1915, right after the war, 1917, he was involved with a lot of Cuban people that lived in that small area of East Harlem that was still predominantly Jewish, but would eventually become what's known as El Barrio or Spanish Harlem. And one of the things that happened to him when he was in school in Puerto Rico, he said, he asked one of his teachers, what were some of the contributions of black people? Him being a black person. And he said, the teacher told him, and I quote, that they have contributed nothing in the world. And I look at it this way. That was a mean thing to say. That was a great kind of racist thing to say. And the thing about it, the effect was, it did something to him that motivated him to change his whole life. From that point on, he collected everything he could find about black people. Either in America, in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Europe, and he collected it. Until in the 1920s, he had one of the largest collections about black people, and the people that he hung out with, the W.E.B. Du Boises, and Philip Randolph, they were amazed that he had collected so much material. It came to a point where the New York Library bought his material for $10,000, and they put it in the Black Library in Harlem. Well, he took the money that he got and went to Europe to do more research and find more information on the contributions of African Americans. So, because of Arturo Schomburg, before we had now we got this big African American museum in Washington, D.C., which I love. Before that, we really didn't have a place for a large collection. And he's one of the first ones that did that. And when they bought his collection, he was put as curator in charge of it for the library system. Now, let's fast forward to 1980s, when a young man like myself was going to the New School for Social Research. And I needed a job. And so I was able to get a job at the New York Research Library on 42nd Street. You know the one with the lines, the one in the Wiz? Yeah, that one. Okay. So I went there, and the guy that was in charge said, you can either work here or we have openings at the one up in Harlem. So I said, the Black Research Library? And you know me, I'm black, I'm black. I went up to Harlem. I forgot to add. It was July. Okay, and it was quite hot in July. Does that make sense? All right. So when I got there, the building that they now have, the new Schomburg Research Building that's on Lenox Avenue and 135th Street, it was being built. So what they did was they took his collection and they put it in a brownstone. If you wanted to borrow something to do research on it, like you were doing a paper and you were a student and you wanted to get something that was in his collection, the people, they call us pages, would have to go upstairs, put it in a box, and there's a hole in the floor. You send it down to them in that hole in the floor. And I said, this is great. And I saw all these books by Richard Wright and James Baldwin and all these great black writers. Then I realized, it's hot in here. Wait a minute. And I said, wait a minute, I love my people and I love culture, but that air conditioning downtown is out of sight. So I didn't take the job. I took the one downtown, and it wasn't too much of a trade-off because everybody was coming in there. Alice Haley had done roots, so everybody was trying to. I worked in the genealogy department, and I helped a lot of people that wanted to find out about how to get their roots. So that's my Arturo Schomburg story. But his lasting legacy is we have the Schomburg Institute, which was the largest collection of material about black people in the world. And now before we had the museum in Washington, we had the Schomburg. And I took my students, when I taught at the College of St. Rose, I took my students down there with a course on Harlem to do research at the Schomburg. And they met, the computers were waiting for them. After that, the lunch was on them. And I said, where you guys gonna go eat? We're going to Sylvia's. I said, well, I'm going out to the village to get falafel. And I'll see you back on campus on Monday. I was told, as quietly as it's kept, there was no fried chicken or cornbread left in Harlem when my students left. And we still laugh about that. We had a good time. So let's go to the next person. Oh, Miss A'Lelia Walker. A'Lelia Walker is somebody that we need to talk more about because she lived in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance, and she was a millionaire. She was an heiress. Most of you heard of her mother, Madam C.J. Walker, who became the first self-made woman millionaire in the United States. I didn't say black woman. Well, I said woman. More than anybody else, Madam C.J. Walker was the first. And the way they had a townhouse in Harlem on 136th Street, I believe. Yes. And what they did with it was the bottom part was a beauty parlor and a beauty school. And then upstairs on the next floor, they decided to convert that. She decided to convert that into what was known as the Dark Tower. And there she would have large parties for artists, musicians, and other people, creative people in her salon. And they say her events at the Dark Tower were like trying to get on the New York City subway. People would be standing outside on the steps and trying to get in. And they say there would be just as many white people trying to get into her events as there were black people. And so she was funny because I read some of the stuff that she wrote about. She was friends with Zora and Langston Hughes and a lot of the other writers. So they would always be there at her events or reading some of their passages. But the thing that she observed was, she said a lot of the whites wanted to be black when they came up here. So she would put them in one room with chitlins and bathtub gin. And she said a lot of the blacks wanted to be white. So she put them in a room with champagne and caviar and a string quartet, and then she would just sit back and look and laugh at all of them. Quite a lady in her time, a black socialite who traveled to Europe. Not only that, she had a big apartment up on Edgecombe Avenue with the rich and famous. On top of that, when she got bored, they had a mansion that still exists, Villa Lewaro, on the Hudson River. And guess what? It was down the street from FDR. Madam C.J. Walker had the mansion built by a black architect, as well as the townhouse in Harlem that was built by a black architect. So the house that they lived in Harlem was torn down in the 40s to build a county colored library. So go to that block, you'll see the library. That's where it used to be. But pictures of it still exist, where the ground still looked like outside and inside, and when they had their parties, they were written about. And for those of you who actually, Villa Lewaro is still available for visits. In fact, I can't wait to hit the lottery because that's where I'm going to buy. No, stop. At least I got to go there. A couple bought it from New Orleans and refurbished it, but it's still online. And it's magnificent. You would not believe what she did. And it was built by a black architect. So a black woman who was the first millionaire built it, and a black architect built it for her. So when A'Lelia passed away, I believe the NAACP took over the mansion, and then it went through some other hands. But her legacy is, during the Harlem Renaissance, is she made sure that the art stayed in Harlem, and she supported the artists. So a lot of the people that we know about today were supported. I must make mention of another part of this, because we talk about Harlem at this particular time. And another one of the cultural events that went on in Harlem was the Harlem Drag Ball. Harlem, as well as being the heavy jazz scene, I had a map that showed all of these different clubs. Then there's another map that just in that same map that shows you all the speakeasies or after-hour clubs. And then they show places that have rent parties where, on every other weekend they have a rent party. It was pretty wide open and very integrated. And the way the Greenwich Village or like Times Square would come, in the 1920s, the word was Harlem was in vogue. Whites went up to Harlem to hang out. And because one of the things was, liquor was illegal, and there were a lot of speakeasies, so if you wanted to get that, you could get it there, and a lot of the gangsters that ran those places made sure that it was available. There were integrated affairs. The Savoy Ballroom was one of the places that was, and we know that the owners made sure that it was going to be that way. But places like the Cotton Club weren't. Now you have, I'm going to speak about this because there are people that will talk about the Harlem Renaissance and take it, you look at it through one lens. It was one of the places in New York City that had a lot of gay culture going on at that time. This Harlem Drag Ball that I was talking about was one of the biggest events in New York City. Movie stars would come from all over to get there, and the competition, people that were into drag would come from Chicago or Orlando or California to win the prizes. And it was blacks as well as whites that would be participating in it. It took place in Harlem. And today, there is a fruit of that. There was a movie called Paris is Burning that dealt with the drag scene that was left over. But it used to be big grand balls with dinners and reservations and tables. They say it would sell out, but big time movie stars and everybody would be there. So it's important that we look at Harlem as it was then. The other fact I want to mention is that the Caribbean community from Trinidad in the 1920s, their last week would have been like the big carnival had not been for the pandemic. They brought that tradition to Harlem, and they would use places like the Renaissance Ballroom or the Savoy to try to have those carnival, but it was an outdoor thing as opposed to indoor thing, so it didn't really work that well. And the lady's name, Miss Wardell, Jessie Wardell, was able to get a permit from the city to get it outside. So they started doing it on Labor Day, which was warm. And by the 1970s, the largest Caribbean community was in Brooklyn. And they had the parade on Eastern Parkway. I remember it in the 70s because I grew up in Crown Heights. And Eastern Parkway, I lived like one block from Eastern Parkway. And so when the parade started, whether you liked it or not, you were in the parade. And everybody was. So today, the largest parade in the United States is the West Indian Day Carnival. They say it generates about $5 million in one day. And now they have hotels in that area and all kinds of other things because Brooklyn's changing. But the other thing I wanted to mention, how many of you heard of Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade? Okay, watch this. To show you how Harlem hadn't changed during the 20s when we talk about the Renaissance, the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade started from where? 125th Street in Harlem, and then went down to 34th Street. I don't know if they changed it when the neighborhood changed, but by the 1930s, it was changed. A lot of you want to know some other facts. We talk about Harlem, and remember in the 1920s and 30s, you have one of the largest Italian American communities in the world that lives in East Harlem. Yeah, in the world, the largest Italian American community lives in East Harlem. And one of the first housing projects they built over on First Avenue is basically filled with Italian Americans. So the Italian American community in East Harlem stays there through the 40s and 50s. Churches, bakeries, the famous restaurant Rao's is still there today. I understand everybody paid $10,000 for their seat, and so unless you know them, you can't get in. But little things like that show that the neighborhood changed. When I go to Harlem, I can remember a professor of mine that lived on 137th Street. Her name was Barbara C. Johnson. Her and her husband David started the Black Studies program for City University. She went to Hunter and Columbia, but at her house on 137th Street and Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, it was painted, you ready? Red, black, and green. And when you went inside, she had gone to Africa 12 times, taking students on trips with the colleges. She had masks all over the walls with lights underneath them from different parts of Africa, zebra skin rug. And then she would hold these events like Madam C.J. Walker would hold, where I go there and we students would be like serving food or drinks to people, and they're sitting John Henry Clark, Ivan Van Sertima, or Brother Ben Yohakim. These were the kind of people that she ran with, and she became community board leader, district leader, Barbara C. Johnson. I remember her well. She's gone now, but she was the person who, as an adult, I started learning about Harlem and seeing it, because before that time, from Brooklyn, the only time I went to Harlem was to go to the Apollo, and then to get back on the train. For me, Brooklyn meant the Apollo. Harlem meant the Apollo Theater. And later on, when I got to know more about the culture, I would go see the murals and to see the Harlem Parade, that type of thing. Let's go on to some of the things that happened. I told you that my students, I took them to Harlem. And Harlem is one of the things my students, I remember we studied Harlem during the Renaissance like we're studying now. And then we also talked about the new Harlem, the Harlem that's got all these restaurants and Starbucks, and the population is not just African American or Hispanic anymore. You have a lot of wealthy white people that moved and bought property in the area. And you see the changes there. So the word gentrified was going around like crazy. And I said, wait a minute, let's stop this. I said, because if you remember when Philip Payton brought blacks into Harlem, they were moving whites out of those buildings. So, it works both ways. And one of the things about the gentrification, and I'm just going to so-called gentrification, or the change, is Harlem could have been like the rest of Manhattan. What happened to Harlem? When the Depression came in, it wiped it out. And one of the things that happened with the Depression is you have like 40% of the people that are unemployed, and then there wasn't welfare or Social Security like there is now. Those things come about during the Depression under the New Deal with Roosevelt. And blacks were the ones that would get this last. In my research during that time period, if it wasn't for, it was said that it had not been for the black churches in Harlem at that time, the people that were poor, really poor, would have really suffered, because they made sure that if anything, you could come by there and get a meal every day or some kind of food. And Adam Clayton Powell himself went downtown to talk to the mayor and tell him, you got to, give us some money so we can help people. They don't have any job. They have nothing. And he would say, okay, come by. You want to make $1? Go sweep out the front. And Adam Clayton Powell Jr. began building up a momentum among the community during the Depression, because they opened their doors to the community. So that's another area that needs to be rewarded. The church's role during the Depression. It's been documented. Let's talk about the walking tour. If you go to the Apollo Theater, the famous Apollo Theater, it's still there. It's a nonprofit organization. Every major entertainer in the world has gone through the Apollo. And the Apollo was once known as the top of the Chitlin circuit, which meant that black entertainers, because of segregation, there were theaters in Georgia, Alabama. I know, for example, in Philadelphia, there was the Uptown Theater. In Baltimore, there was the Regal. And in Chicago, you had the Regal Theater. In LA, I think it's the Alhambra. But every one of these cities, there were places where African American entertainers went through. And the Chitlin circuit lasted through the 70s. If you have black race, that's where I need to go with this. That whole thing with race records led to black radio stations you have a black radio station that plays Benny King and the Drifters, and a white pop station that plays Perry Como, Frank Sinatra, and maybe Nat King Cole, and maybe the Drifters, right? So the race records meant that you automatically were going to get less money. If you got into the pop scene, you're going to make more money. And the only people by the 60s that got there were Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, okay, and Johnny Mathis, that basically had crossed over and were making a lot of money from the pop scene. So The Apollo Theater, yeah, Johnny Mathis, Sammy Davis Jr., Harry Belafonte. My memory of first going to the Apollo is my grandfather came home one night. It's 1965. Yeah, I'm giving my age away. He said, I ain't going to work tonight, because he's from down south, you know. He worked at Birmingham Community College as a janitor. We going to the Apollo, see James Brown. So we got this Chevrolet, rode up there. Now watch this. He had to tell his cousin that we were parking his car on Lenox Avenue because his cousin came downstairs to tell the junkies in front of the bar that was his cousin's car, because otherwise, when we came back to get the car, it would have either been gone or been stripped, okay? And so that's how Harlem was. The drug thing was really rough in those days. When we went, I remember James Brown came on, and I wanted to jump on that stage. I never seen that. This is when he did the whole cake thing and please jumped around, but the band was jumping. You know, that's when he had his really live show. So the Apollo's there, it's legend, and they do have tours that you can book. But inside, there's a beautiful mirror of all the famous artists on the wall that somebody painted. And on the side, we were talking about this earlier, is pictures of all the new hip-hop artists like Biggie and LL Cool J and Run DMC, you know, the new kids on the block. And so they keep with the trend, the heritage. Across the street was Bobby's record store, the only first black-owned business on 125th Street. And with this change came about, he had to move around the corner because the rent went up to like $100,000, whatever. But Bobby's record store was responsible for helping the hip hop thing to generate itself, because he produced with Sylvia the Sugar Hill Gang. Who's the Sugar Hill Gang? Oh, am I giving my age away? I said the hip hop, you know, stop rocking to the fan, man. Please, I'm never mind. You got it. Okay, next slide, please. That's the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture as it is today. It is a wonderful trip, a day trip that you should, free to get into, nice gift shop. I advise people that have children to take them to let them see that, because they do have a children's section there. The gift shop is very nice. You can always get nice things. They always have events going on there, plays and poetry readings and dance recitals and film series. And one of the things that's memorable is Langston Hughes is buried there. There's a room that has his poem, I've Known Rivers, that's made out of bronze. And you have to go see that to believe it. The famous Langston is there. And so it's right across the street from our next place. And remember, Arturo Schomburg, our friend from Puerto Rico that wanted to collect all these things on Black culture, made all of this possible. So it's before you had the African American Museum, Schomburg was the place to go. And a lot of people that were doing research, getting their doctorates on African American studies, they went to the Schomburg because he had lots of material on Africa, the Caribbean, the South, slavery, Harlem, Chicago, South Side. It's all there, still is. My students loved it. Next. Across the street, if you're doing a walk into directly across the street, is Harlem Hospital. And during the Depression, Augusta Savage, who we saw before, was able to get federal money to get black artists that lived in Harlem an opportunity to get a grant to work. And one of the things that they did, they did theater projects as well, but one of the most famous things that stands was the mural they did in Harlem Hospital. That mural, it only has black people in it. It tells kind of our history. It's very big. It's very beautiful. And it was done during the Depression in the early 30s. And what happened was, because of the kind of material that they used, it began to chip away or change or erode. So there's a nonprofit organization through Columbia University that since the 80s has been responsible for getting the money to repair the murals and keep them done. So that's something you need to see. If there was a day trip, you could go to the library, you could go across the street to see the murals, and other interesting things on a walking tour that are free in Harlem. One thing, you get a camera, every street has got a black name. Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, Malcolm X Boulevard, Frederick Sellers Avenue. You name it, they're there. And they have all kind of, there's, I believe, by 110th Street, over by Central Park, there are statues of Duke Ellington playing the piano, and statues of Malcolm X and Harriet Tubman. Throughout Harlem, there are those things that are free that you can go to. If you go down to 116th Street on Lenox Avenue, you will see the famous mosque that Malcolm X taught and preached at. It's a beautiful building. It's still there, and you should include that in your trip. If you go to the east of 116th Street, you're in what's known as El Barrio, Spanish Harlem. And that's famous because they have a place there under Park Avenue, under the Metro North train station, called La Marqueta. And there's a lot of vendors, Hispanic vendors in there, as well as all kinds of other vendors now. It's been expanded. The city's putting money in. It's a landmark. And when it's cold, you can go inside and just stay in there and shop. It's like going to a mall underneath the train station. That's one of the things I enjoy about Harlem. Just to walk around Harlem on a nice spring day, you'll see a lot of beautiful things. If you go on the east side, if you go further over on the west side, you're at Columbia University in Harlem. Oh yeah, Columbia University is in Harlem. They want to say Riverside Drive. You can smell the collard greens and coochie pizza. I know what I'm talking about, okay? So it still always had its potential. And the next time I do a series here, I'll talk about what happened to Harlem in the 1950s, predominantly the drug problem, but at the same time, some of the people that came through the 50s were legends for life, and mainly in literature as well as the arts, as well as sociology. And I'm going to name a few: Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte, Cicely Tyson, Diana Carroll, Eartha Kitt, Sammy Davis Jr., and you can't talk about rock and roll without talking about Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. We happen to be a bunch of African American kids and Puerto Rican kids who turned the rock and roll game upside down in 1 year, and they were all from Harlem. So I can tell that a lot of you want to go to Harlem, and you should. And I want you to see what Harlem is like now, because the fruit of the Renaissance still prevails in terms of the culture in Harlem. Harlem has remained a cultural capital, and people, there's a lot more African people that live there. There's a lot of Caribbean presence. There's still African American presence. There's a lot of things in Harlem now since this so-called gentrification came, where Harlem looks a little bit more like downtown Manhattan. And you don't have to go to find a Gap store down to 86th Street. The Gap store now moved to Harlem. And it should have been like that years ago, but the politics and economics of all that is something that overrides me. And I'm from Brooklyn, and I've seen how Brooklyn changed over the last 10 or 15 years since I've moved up to the Capital Region area. When I go back, I'm always amazed. I got off the train where I used to work at for the court system downtown Brooklyn, and I thought I needed a map to get from one side to the. I mean, they didn't just do one store. They did blocks and blocks and blocks, hotels across from a jail. Really, it's wonderful. So, if some of you should think about it, we get a walking tour together in Harlem. We could leave from here, go to Greyhound, get the bus down, or we could hire a bus to take us to Metro North and get the train and get off in Harlem, and then you can do your walk from there. Have lunch at Sylvia's or any other black place that's there, because you have a lot of restaurants other than Sylvia just as good. How many heard of Spoon Bread and Strawberry Wine? The Darden sisters, they were models. They had that there. There's the Red Rooster. I think Londell's is still there, right? And let me tell you, I don't know about you, but there's a fish place on 145th Street, and they line up. It's open almost all night. And they got some of the best fish that you want to get. You want a real greasy fish sandwich and chips, go ahead and load it up. So let's look at Harlem the way it is now, because that rhythm and that ride and that creativity and that culture still remains. So let's take a look at it. And I'd like to thank the African American Cultural Center for having me here this evening again. And hello to everybody out there that's watching, and happy Black History Month. My name is Don Hyman. It's like they hear, but we don't hear. Okay, we're back, and thank you again for sitting here listening about the wonderful stories of Harlem and some of the famous people that live there. It's Black History Month, okay? You gotta wait a whole month for this. So in the meantime, go and read about Marcus Garvey and Zora Neale Hurston and Philip Payton and Duke Ellington. Listen to some of his music. Don't let the opportunity pass by. Don't wait till a whole year before you decide to learn about this stuff again. I gave it to you so you could go out and expand your consciousness, okay? All right? So as Marcus Garvey would say, happy Black History Month, and Black is beautiful. Just look at me.